The macabre history of the YatesA wealthy woman raised 12 kids with numbers instead of names. Discovery that would expose one of the most psychologically devastating cases of maternal control in modern American history came not through investigation or accident, but through the desperate actions of a young woman who had spent her entire life known only as Number 7. In the spring of 2021, she walked into the offices of the Connecticut Department of Children and Families with a story so disturbing that initial investigators assumed she was suffering from delusions or elaborate fantasy. Number 7, who appeared to be in her early 20s with the pale, nervous demeanor of someone unaccustomed to public spaces, claimed that she and 11 other individuals had been raised by a wealthy woman who had systematically denied them personal names, individual identity, and basic human recognition as autonomous beings. They had lived their entire lives in a grand estate where they were referred to only by numbers, arranged in a rigid hierarchy that determined every aspect of their existence from birth until their escape. The woman she described as their mother was Eleanor Yates, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune that had been built during the early 20th century through patents on various psychiatric medications. Eleanor had inherited not only enormous wealth, but also a sprawling estate in the hills of western Connecticut that had been in the Yates family since the 1890s, along with a family history of mental illness and obsessive behavior that had been carefully hidden behind generations of wealth and social position. Number 7's account revealed that Eleanor Yates had been systematically acquiring children through private adoption agencies and international humanitarian organizations throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, using her wealth and social connections to bypass normal oversight and documentation requirements. She had specifically sought children who were orphaned, displaced, or from circumstances that made their disappearance unlikely to trigger investigation. But what made Eleanor's treatment of these children uniquely disturbing was not the methods by which she had acquired them, but the systematic dehumanization she had subjected them to once they were under her control. From the moment they arrived at the Yates estate, the children were stripped of any names they might have possessed and assigned numbers based on the order of their arrival and Eleanor's assessment of their potential value to her household. Numbering system was not arbitrary, but reflected Eleanor's obsessive belief that individual identity was a form of chaos that prevented optimal human development. She had convinced herself that children raised without the burden of personal names and individual recognition would develop superior capabilities for rational thinking, emotional control, and collective cooperation that would make them more efficient and productive than conventionally raised individuals. Number 1 through Number 12 lived in dormitory-style accommodations within the mansion, with their living arrangements, educational opportunities, and even food allocation determined by their numerical ranking. Higher numbers received better treatment, more advanced education, and greater privileges, while lower numbers were assigned menial tasks and received minimal attention or resources. The hierarchy was not fixed, but could change based on Eleanor's periodic assessments of each child's performance, intelligence, and usefulness to the household. Children could be promoted or demoted within the numerical system based on their ability to meet Eleanor's standards for productivity, obedience, and rational behavior. This created a constant atmosphere of competition and anxiety as the children struggled to maintain or improve their position within the artificial social structure that Eleanor had created. Number 7's account revealed that the children had been systematically conditioned to suppress individual desires, emotional expression, and personal relationships in favor of collective efficiency and absolute obedience to Eleanor's authority. They had been taught that their numbers represented their value to the household and that their worth as human beings was entirely dependent on their ability to fulfill the roles that Eleanor had assigned to them. The educational system that Eleanor had established reflected her obsession with rationality and efficiency over human development. The children received advanced instruction in mathematics, sciences, and practical skills, but they were denied exposure to literature, arts, or subjects that might encourage individual creativity or emotional expression. Their education was designed to produce capable workers and obedient servants rather than autonomous individuals with personal interests and ambitions. But perhaps most disturbing was Eleanor's systematic suppression of emotional bonds between the children. They were forbidden from forming personal relationships, expressing affection for each other, or developing the kind of sibling connections that would normally characterize children raised in the same household. Eleanor viewed emotional attachment as inefficiency that distracted from rational thinking and productive work. When Connecticut Department of Children and Families investigators finally gained access to the Yates estate in June 2021, they discovered a facility that challenged every assumption about family structure, child development, and the relationship between wealth and parental authority. The mansion had been converted into what could only be described as a human efficiency laboratory where 12 individuals had been raised as experimental subjects rather than children deserving love and individual recognition. The physical evidence supported Number 7's account in disturbing detail. The children's living quarters were arranged in numerical order, with clear distinctions in quality and comfort that reflected their ranking within Eleanor's hierarchy. Personal belongings were minimal and identical, with no individual customization or personal expression permitted. Even clothing was assigned based on numerical ranking, with higher numbers receiving better quality and more varied wardrobes. The 11 individuals still living at the estate when investigators arrived ranged in age from 15 to 28, but they displayed behavioral characteristics that made accurate age assessment difficult. They had been conditioned to suppress normal emotional development and personal expression to such an extent that they seemed to exist in a state of artificial arrested development, functioning as efficient workers but lacking the psychological characteristics typically associated with young adults. Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist brought in to assess the psychological impact of Eleanor's treatment, found evidence of systematic dehumanization that represented one of the most extreme cases of identity suppression she had encountered in her career. The children had been conditioned to view themselves not as individuals with inherent worth and rights, but as numbered components in Eleanor's household efficiency system. They displayed no sense of personal identity beyond their numerical designation, no capacity for individual decision-making, and no understanding of normal human relationships based on affection, shared interests, or mutual support. They had been systematically trained to evaluate themselves and others based entirely on productivity and usefulness rather than the emotional and social connections that characterize healthy human development. Eleanor Yates herself, when confronted by investigators, showed no recognition that her treatment of the children was problematic or harmful. She viewed her numbering system as a rational improvement over conventional child rearing, explaining that individual names and personal identity created unnecessary confusion and emotional complications that prevented optimal human development. Her personal papers revealed decades of planning and theoretical development that had convinced her that human society would benefit from eliminating individual identity in favor of efficient collective organization. She had used the children as test subjects for her theories about human productivity and social organization, viewing their responses to her conditioning as data that validated her beliefs about optimal human development. The financial records discovered at the estate showed that Eleanor had invested millions of dollars in creating what she viewed as a model household that could serve as a prototype for future social organization. She had established detailed documentation of the children's development, productivity, and psychological responses that she intended to use as evidence for the superiority of her numbering system over conventional family structures. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Eleanor had been planning to expand her experiment beyond the 12 children already under her control. She had been making arrangements to acquire additional children and establish similar facilities in other locations, with the ultimate goal of creating a network of numbered individuals who could serve as the foundation for what she called rational human society. The children themselves presented unprecedented challenges for child welfare authorities who were trained to address conventional forms of abuse and neglect. They showed no obvious signs of physical harm and had received education and care that exceeded what many American children experienced. But they had also been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning that had effectively erased their individual humanity while creating profound dependencies that made independent life extremely difficult. Most disturbing was their apparent contentment with their numbered existence. They showed no desire for individual names or personal identity, expressing confusion and anxiety when offered choices or encouraged to express personal preferences. Eleanor's conditioning had been so complete that the children genuinely believed that individual identity was a form of chaos that would make them less capable and less valuable as human beings. The investigation revealed that Eleanor's numbering system represented something unprecedented in the spectrum of child abuse. The systematic transformation of children into human resources through psychological conditioning that eliminated individual identity while maintaining the appearance of providing superior care and education. As authorities attempted to understand the full scope of Eleanor's impact on the 12 individuals she had raised, they realized they were confronting a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about childhood, identity, and the relationship between efficiency and humanity that would influence child welfare policy and psychological research for years to come. The psychological investigation that followed the discovery of Eleanor Yates's numbering system would reveal one of the most sophisticated and disturbing examples of systematic identity destruction in the annals of American child psychology, exposing how mathematical thinking could be weaponized to eliminate the fundamental characteristics that make humans capable of love, creativity, and autonomous choice. Dr. Margaret Chun, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Eleanor Yates's mental state and the psychological impact of her conditioning system, discovered that the wealthy heiress had been developing her theories about numerical human organization for over 3 decades, drawing inspiration from industrial efficiency models, mathematical optimization theory, and her own profound psychological disorders that made normal human emotional connections impossible for her to understand or tolerate. Eleanor's personal papers, discovered in extensive archives throughout the mansion, revealed a worldview shaped by her inheritance of both enormous wealth and severe psychological disorders that had been hidden within the Yates family for generations. Her grandfather, who had built the pharmaceutical fortune, had suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder and had organized his business empire according to rigid mathematical principles that eliminated unpredictable human elements from all operations. Eleanor had inherited not only his wealth, but his psychological compulsions, along with additional mental health issues that had been exacerbated by her complete isolation from normal social relationships throughout her own childhood. She had been raised by hired caregivers in the same mansion where she would later implement her numbering system, receiving education but no emotional nurturing or instruction in normal human relationships. Dr. Chian's analysis revealed that Eleanor's numbering system was not simply an eccentric approach to child rearing, but the product of severe psychological disorders that made her incapable of understanding children as individual human beings deserving love and personal recognition. She viewed them as variables in mathematical equations that could be optimized through proper organization and control. The conditioning methods that Eleanor had developed over decades of experimentation represented a systematic approach to eliminating every aspect of human development that she viewed as inefficient or chaotic. The children had been subjected to behavioral modification techniques that suppressed individual personality, emotional expression, and creative thinking in favor of predictable responses and measurable productivity. The numbering system itself was designed to create what Eleanor called rational hierarchy, based on objective assessment of capabilities and performance rather than the emotional favoritism that she believed characterized normal family relationships. Children were regularly tested and evaluated using metrics that Eleanor had developed to measure productivity, obedience, emotional control, and usefulness to household operations. But Dr. Chen's investigation revealed that Eleanor's metrics were fundamentally flawed because they measured only characteristics that served her psychological needs rather than indicators of healthy human development. The children who received higher numbers and better treatment were those who had most successfully suppressed their individual humanity, while those who retained traces of normal emotional expression or personal desire were ranked lower and subjected to additional conditioning. The educational system that Eleanor had established reflected her belief that human knowledge could be optimized by eliminating subjects that encouraged individual creativity or emotional development. The children received advanced training in mathematics, sciences, and practical skills that could be measured and quantified, but they were denied exposure to literature, arts, history, or social studies that might encourage them to think about human experience in ways that challenged Eleanor's numerical worldview. Most disturbing was Eleanor's systematic destruction of emotional bonds and personal relationships among the children. She had implemented protocols that prevented them from forming friendships, expressing affection, or developing the kind of mutual support systems that characterize healthy group dynamics. The children were trained to view each other as competitors for numerical ranking rather than as potential sources of emotional connection and support. Dr. Chen's psychological evaluations revealed that Eleanor's conditioning had achieved its intended goals while devastating the children's capacity for normal human relationships and individual development. They demonstrated remarkable efficiency in performing assigned tasks and showed no behavioral problems or emotional outbursts that might disrupt household operations. But they also displayed profound deficits in creativity, empathy, and autonomous thinking that made them incapable of functioning as independent adults in normal society. The children had been systematically trained to suppress the psychological characteristics that enable humans to form relationships, pursue personal interests, and make autonomous choices about their lives. They viewed themselves as components in Eleanor's household system, rather than as individuals with inherent worth and the right to pursue happiness and fulfillment according to their own desires and capabilities. Financial analysis revealed that Eleanor had invested over $50 million in developing and implementing her numbering system, funding research into psychological conditioning, educational methods, and evaluation techniques that she believed would prove the superiority of her approach to human development. She had maintained detailed documentation of the children's responses to her conditioning, treating them as experimental subjects rather than as individuals deserving protection and care. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Eleanor had been corresponding with researchers and theorists in other countries who shared her beliefs about the necessity of eliminating individual identity in favor of more efficient forms of human organization. Her work was part of a broader international movement of individuals who viewed normal human emotional development as an obstacle to optimal social organization. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery that several of the children had begun to internalize Eleanor's worldview and were expressing interest in implementing similar numbering systems when they eventually left the estate. The conditioning had been so complete that some of the children genuinely believed that individual identity was a form of psychological illness that prevented optimal human functioning. Eleanor herself, when subjected to comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, was diagnosed with multiple severe mental disorders, including obsessive-compulsive disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and attachment disorders that made normal human emotional connections impossible for her to form or understand. Her numbering system was revealed to be an elaborate defense mechanism that allowed her to interact with children while avoiding the emotional vulnerability that normal parental relationships would have required. Dr. Chien's final report concluded that Eleanor's treatment of the children represented a unique form of psychological abuse that had systematically destroyed their capacity for individual identity while creating profound dependencies that made independent life extremely challenging. The children had been transformed into human machines that could perform designated functions efficiently, but lacked the emotional and creative capabilities necessary for autonomous human existence. The legal challenges were unprecedented because Eleanor's conditioning had not involved obvious physical abuse or deprivation. The children had received excellent medical care, nutrition, and education that exceeded what many American children experienced. But they had also been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation that had effectively erased their individual humanity while creating the appearance of superior development and care. The children themselves presented complex challenges for therapeutic intervention because they had been conditioned to resist normal human relationships and view individual identity as a form of dysfunction. Traditional approaches to therapy and rehabilitation were inadequate for addressing individuals who had been systematically trained to suppress the psychological characteristics that therapy was designed to restore. Federal authorities ultimately placed the children in specialized residential facilities designed to provide intensive therapy while gradually introducing them to concepts of individual identity, personal choice, and emotional expression that Eleanor's conditioning had systematically eliminated. Some showed remarkable progress in developing individual personality and emotional capabilities, while others remained psychologically committed to the numerical identity system that had defined their entire existence. Eleanor Yates was committed to a psychiatric facility where she continued to defend her numbering system as a rational improvement over conventional human development, showing no insight into the psychological damage her conditioning had caused. She remained convinced that individual identity was a form of mental illness that prevented optimal human functioning and social organization. The case led to significant changes in oversight of private educational facilities and residential arrangements for children, establishing new protocols for identifying and preventing systematic identity suppression disguised as alternative education or therapeutic intervention. But the fundamental questions raised by Eleanor's numbering system continue to influence debates about human identity, individual rights, and the relationship between efficiency and humanity in modern society. Her experiment had demonstrated that systematic conditioning could eliminate individual personality and create highly efficient human workers, but at costs that destroyed the essential characteristics that make life worth living. The 12 individuals who had been raised as numbers rather than names remain living evidence that human identity can be systematically destroyed through psychological conditioning, but that such destruction represents a form of murder that kills the soul while leaving the body intact. Their ongoing recovery serves as a reminder that the protection of children requires vigilance not only against obvious forms of abuse, but against systematic programs that treat individual identity as an obstacle to be eliminated, rather than as the foundation of human dignity and autonomous choice. The macabre history of the Yates family revealed that the greatest threats to children might come from those who view love itself as inefficiency and individual identity as a problem to be solved through mathematical precision and psychological control. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,